sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Avram Davidson universe. Today we have a fantastic guest, Joseph D. Agnes, and I'm hopeful I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, so I apologize in advance if I'm not. He's a writer, journalist, ghostwriter, known mostly for mystery. He won the Derringer Award and was a finalist many times. He was introduced to me by Robert Lopresti, and so thank you so much for that introduction. Today we're going to be listening to Captain Pasharooney, originally published in Saint, May of 1967. He should be on any second. In terms of news, I suppose the biggest news is by the time this episode goes live, we should be very close to being done with Dragons in the Trees, which is very exciting news. So with that, I am about to bring on Joseph. Joseph, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I'm really excited. I mean, I guess a great starting place. I gave a very short introduction before you came on, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I mean, if you would say to me, like, how do you earn a living in this world as a writer? And that's what I am. I am a writer. I've been a writer since I was 12 years old. I am primarily known as a ghostwriter in the traditional publishing world. I write books for other people who do not have the skills or the desire to write their own books, so they hire me. In terms of my passions, I've always been interested in the mystery genre, and I, wrote short stories as a kid. I was obsessed as a kid since I think 1970 or 71, maybe 75 to 76. I'm dating myself. I was interested in Ellery Queen because it was an Ellery Queen TV show starring, I believe it was Jim Hutton, the actor. And I started reading the Ellery Queen novels, and then eventually graduated to the Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine and Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, which had a long history just going back to the 40s. And I would start sending out stories to them even when I was 12 or 13 years old. And they always came back with a resounding rejection, which was fantastic. And I got very used to rejection from an early age. But then, like, just as I got older, it was like, well, short stories don't pay the bills, so let's just not do them. And then somehow at around age 50, I started submitting stories again to Ellery Queen's and Alfred Hitchcock's. And with the very first story, I sold that to Hitchcock's. Ellery Queen rejected it, and I was like, oh, well, this is a pretty sucky story. And then next thing you know, I got an email saying Hitchcock would buy it. And then within like 2 or 3 years, I was in like Best American Mystery Stories. They an anthology, annual anthology that picked up one of the stories. So I thought, okay, you don't actually suck as a short story writer, and you should keep doing this. And I've been doing this as much as my schedule will allow.
And in terms of, I'm actually very curious about the ghostwriting aspect that you do. There's 2 questions I have on that. The first is, how do people find you? In terms of, right? Like, I know Fiverr is a place where people list their possibility of a ghostwriter.
Okay.
How do people find you?
So to be clear, I write books that are for people who are being traditionally published. So this may not be, people may not understand this, but like if you look at the nonfiction New York Times bestseller list, you will see a long list of maybe 15 books every Sunday that are reported. About 60 or 70% of those books are ghost written by someone. And it's always, nonfiction has the higher number. There are people who ghost fiction, but they're usually in major franchises like Star Trek, Star Wars, Men in Black, things like that. And there are writers that, you know, they started doing that and now they can call themselves New York Times bestsellers because they wrote those books and they had a byline on the book and it ended up on the bestseller list. So now they can call themselves New York Times bestsellers. I predominantly write nonfiction. None of my clients have ever hit the bestseller list. I blame them, not me. But I mean, so ghostwriting has been around for a long time. Your godfather did ghostwriting, and I understood that probably about the time I graduated from college. I understood that the Ellery Queen novels that I grew up loving as a kid, he wrote 2 of them, and On the Eighth Day is one. The second one was Fourth Side of the Triangle. I don't love Fourth Side of the Triangle, but I really love And on the Eighth Day, and I can go into that, you know, later if you want. But
Sure.
that's one of my favorite books. And it wasn't until I was like out of college that I understood that Avram wrote those. And then I was like, okay, who's Avram? And I remembered like finding late 90s, I remembered finding like a remaindered copy of the Treasury, Davidson Treasury. Probably at that point, I was working in New York City, and it was probably on Upper Broadway, like the Strand or one of those bookstores that were there in New York City. And I grabbed it and I just started digging into it. I was like, oh, okay, so he's into mystery fiction and he's also into fantasy and science fiction, which, you know, I also read, but I wasn't as deep into science fiction and fantasy as much as I was into mystery. So I understood who he was until about the time I graduated from college.
And out of curiosity, any favorite Avram stories that you have?
Okay. The ones that resonated with me are often the most poignant ones, and I'm going to need your help on the titles. Now Let Us Sleep.
Yep.
Is so powerful and soul crushing in a way, and it is a science fiction short story, and it eats at you because you understand his deep humanity and his gift for sympathizing with marginalized people and species. I mean, let's just throw it out there, right? I mean, you know, that's what he's doing in that short story. What time is it? I did not know of that story until I heard it on your podcast. And that is, again, it is neither mystery. I believe it's a crime story, but it is a work of literary fiction. It is not science fiction, it is not fantasy. It speaks to the Holocaust, and it is one of the most powerful short stories. I almost feel like sending it out to many of my friends who are interested in anything to do with nonfiction about the Holocaust. It is a gripping story, but he wrote it as fiction. And I understand the discussion. I heard you guys talk about it. The other one is, I don't remember the title. It's the one about the Native Americans who are losing their land. Is it Where the
Grasses Grow?
Where the Grasses Grow.
Or the grasses grow.
Or the Grasses Grow. Okay, so that is also deeply moving. And here's a guy who's writing the story. I don't remember what year he wrote that, but like he's writing in 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, New York City, and he's sympathizing with the plight of Native Americans. We're giving a crap about that now as a country. We're finally waking up to what has happened. He was caring about that way back then. That's one of his earliest stories.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is.
right.
Well, and I should add to that. It's one of his earliest stories that was published.
Right.
What time is it? Can you? I mean, not to. I've already gone through this in another podcast, but what time is it? Was never published.
Yeah, stunning. How is that possible? Probably because the genre editors were looking at this going, so like, it's not mystery and it's not science fiction or fantasy, so we don't know what to do with this. If he sent it out, I don't know who he would have sent it out to, but I think he also submitted his work to, I mean, did he write for places like, I mean, I don't even know if this is contemporaneous with his time, but like, did he write for Collier's? Did he write for, Saturday Evening Post or general magazines?
Later he did.
Later,
But,
yeah. Okay.
But going back to what time it is, and I've talked about this before. First of all, he wasn't known yet, so
right.
he was a not known author, so that was the first problem. And second of all, I mean, I think he wrote that when he was in his late 20s, and it was a subject that I'm sure people wouldn't want to touch at that time.
Yeah, exactly. But think about the talent of someone who could write that in their 20s. This is the thing that I keep coming back to, and why I think people need to pay attention to his work. As a giant body of work, he's playing in all these different genres, different types of stories. You get, I mean, that crazy Lord of Central Park is an insane story that touches on so many different topics. And then you have like I Am Dr. Morris Goldpepper. Wait, help! I Am Dr. Morris Goldpepper. That is hilarious, but it's also science fiction, and it's deeply thought out. The story about the safety pins. That what the hell is the name of that story?
All the Season's Oysters.
All the Season's Oysters. So like, what an incredible range. When I was starting out as a young writer, I remember asking her, creative, I'm going to use a dirty word in about 2 seconds, that you're going to have to mark this explicit. I asked a professor to provide me, a creative writing professor, to provide me with a recommendation letter. This is what you always do when you're in college. And she wrote it, and she says, like, Joe Degnice has this fecund imagination. And I'm like, what the hell is that word? Like, I have to go look this up. What's fecund? Like, even then I didn't even know. What that means is like you have a fertile imagination. But I remember going to my like journalism professor, and I'm like, here, read this thing. What does she mean by fecund? And he's like, well, fecund comes from the word feces, which means you're full of shit. Well, Avram had a shitty imagination that was like exploding, if I can continue this analogy, with like incredible depth of erudition, knowledge, deep scholarship. And I'm going to get into that after we listen to the short story, because it took me a lot of time to look up a lot of the references that he is talking about in this short story.
Well, I say this is a really good time to just get right into the story.
Yeah, let's get into it. Yeah.
Let's do it.
Captain Pasharooney. Captain Pasharooney was published in 1967 when Davidson's son, Ethan, was 5 years old. Avram Davidson loved children and always spoke to them with grave respect. He regarded them as small people, deserving the same consideration as big people. This touching story captures the speech and thoughts of a child. Although the story has a neat plot twist, it was written right from Avram's heart. G.D. The great big Cadillac drew up in front of the school in the middle of the morning. A uniformed chauffeur was at the wheel, and a man all dressed up in striped pants and a derby hat got out from in front and opened the door of the back. The children in the schoolyard were already gathering and looking through the wire mesh fence. "Hey, look at the Rolls-Royce." "It ain't a Rolls-Royce, it's a caddy." "How much you want to bet it's a Rolls-Royce?" You haven't got anything to bet, and besides, a caddy's just as good as a Rolls-Royce." The man who got out of the door held open for him was tall and broad-shouldered, though rather pale. A thin mustache rode his short upper lip. He wore a dark overcoat with a velvet collar and had an astrakhan cap cocked slightly to one side of his head. "Thank you, Jarvis," he said. "Very good, sir." The tall man trotted nimbly up the front steps of the school and vanished inside. "Gee, will you look at the butler?" How do you know he's a butler?" "Look at the way he's dressed. Didn't you ever see a butler in the movies or television? And besides, didn't you hear him say, 'Very good, sir'? That's what butlers always say." Gee. A janitor, leaning on his broom, looked up in surprise at the rapid, brisk sound of adult male feet. The man in the astrakhan cap tossed 2 words at him without slowing down. "The office?" "Yes, sir. Right to the left, them stairs as you come to the top, sir. Right to the—" The tall man nodded curtly, tossed something that glittered. The janitor lunged for it. "The left of them stairs," caught it. The tall man went out of sight, though not sound. Another, younger janitor came up, bent over to look. "What did he give you, Barney?" Barney held it up. "Hey, a silver dollar! I haven't seen one of those in a long time. Who was he? Do you know?" Barney nodded. "He was a gentleman," he said, "and I haven't seen one of those in a long time either." The tall man walked into the office, smiled at the squat, ugly woman at the desk, bowing slightly as he did so, sweeping off the astrakhan cap. "I'm Major Thompson," he said. "Oh," she said. "Oh, yes. Why, I believe the principal is expecting me." "Oh, yes, he is, Major," she smiled back, blushed. "Mr. Buckley," she called, trying to push back a recalcitrant chair. "Mr. Buck." Major Thompson said, "Allow me, ma'am," as he gave the chair a no-nonsense tug and the lady a helpful hand under her elbow. She blushed again. The frosted glass on the door of the inner office quivered a second before the door itself opened, and a thin man with pince-nez spectacles, a few strands of graying sandy hair combed optimistically over his bald spot, came bustling out. "Yes, Miss Schultz, what—" "Oh!" Very tall, very broad-shouldered, Major Thompson held out his arm straightly. "Major Thompson," Miss Schultz said in a loud whisper, and, "Dr. Buckley," said the major, taking and pumping the hand of the principal. "A pleasure, sir." The thin little man beamed. Then his face quivered. "It's, Mr. Buckley," he said. "Of course, I have my M.A., and I always intended, but—" Major Thompson smiled. "Confidentially," he said in a lower tone. "Confidentially, I never even took my A.B., he chuckled. "What do you think of that? Too much celebrating. Harvard-Yale game, my senior year, suspended me?" He laughed, a hearty laugh. Mr. Buckley laughed back. "I could have returned the year after that, but, well, it so happened that by that time I had other interests. Well, he concluded, on a note neatly blending regret and satisfaction. "How's the boy?" he asked abruptly, seriously. Mr. Buckley cocked his head and raised his eyebrows. "Jimmy, how shall I put it, Major? Jimmy has, I believe I am justified in saying, a very considerable potential—" Softly, gravely, Major Thompson said, "But he isn't realizing that potential. Is that it, sir?" The principal was almost distressed. He hoped that Major Thompson would not misunderstand him. He had discussed the matter with Mrs. Morley, a very fine woman, Mrs. Morley. He had just hung up the phone on her call, telling him to expect the major the minute he walked in the door, almost. He had discussed the matter with Mrs. Morley once or twice, after all. She was the boy's foster mother, in a way. Major Thompson said, "Have you met my sister?" No, I never have. I wrote to her, but she never replied. I know. She never replies to my letters either. If my wife were still alive—" There was a silence. Then Mr. Buckley, in some embarrassment, said, "You see, one of the difficulties about Jimmy, besides the matter of his schoolwork, is, well, how shall I put this? His, tendency to exaggerate?" The Seth Thomas clock on the office wall ticked loudly. "Such as? For example?" Mr. Buckley's thin face reddened ever so slightly. He looked down, he looked around, but the other man was implacable. "Such as what, sir?" The principal took a deep breath. "Well, he told everybody, his teachers, his friends, Mrs. Morley, me, that—" Major Thompson smiled. "Told you, perhaps, that his father had a ranch in South America with 10,000 horses, eh?" "Yes," exclaimed Mr. Buckley. Still smiling, the major said, "Mr. Buckley, I have no idea how many horses there are on my various South American properties." The little man's ear caught the plural. His eyelids fluttered with dawning understanding. "There may be well over that number, all told. We just don't count them down there, horses. Now as to cattle, I can give you without any difficulty—" He reached into his inner pocket. "The latest statistics on them, if you like." Just as Mr. Buckley was assuring Major Thompson that it wasn't in the least necessary, the outer door opened and Miss Schultz came back in, shepherding a small and most reluctant little boy in front of her. The boy observed Mr. Buckley's ear-to-ear smile with some misgivings and started to turn away. But Miss Schultz blocked the way. "Do you know who this is, Jimmy?" she asked, pushing him forward. The tall man bent over, slowly, and put his hand on Jimmy's shoulder. The boy looked up at him in utter astonishment. He opened his mouth, shook his head. Miss Schultz tittered joyfully, gave him a friendly little shove forward. "Who is it that lives in South America," asked Mr. Buckley archly, "and has many, many horses," the boy blushed scarlet, "on several ranches, hey? Guess." At first, Jimmy would not lift his head. Then he did. His expression was almost defiant. He stared up at the tall man in front of him. Then his mouth opened. He pointed. "I remember you," he cried. "Now I remember. At my mother's. We had green ice cream," Major Thompson said gently. Yes, it was pistachio. The strange word seemed to throw the boy off balance. "I don't remember that. It was green," Mr. Buckley said, still beaming. "Pistachio is green." Angrily, Jimmy said, "Well, I don't remember. How could I? I was only about 4 years old." His voice had risen to a shout. He burst into tears. Major Thompson went down on one knee and took him in his arms. "I didn't remember that you were my father," the boy sobbed. "I didn't remember it." His father patted him gently, while Miss Schultz blew her big nose, and Mr. Buckley took off his glasses and wiped the inner corners of his eyes with thumb and forefinger. The principal of the school agreed, not only without reluctance but even eagerly, that Jimmy might take the day off to be with his father. "Why, under the circumstances, certainly, Major, certainly," he said. "I understand. Perfectly. What a shame, though, after all these years away, that you have to go back so soon." He clicked his tongue. "I wish," he said. "I wish, too, but I have to be in Washington very shortly, and then, well, back to South America. Things aren't too well down there, as I'm sure you know." Mr. Buckley did know. It was the heritage of Spain, he supposed. All those generations of fighting the Moors had made the Spanish so bellicose. Jimmy came back with his coat and cap, and an expression on his face both incredulous and self-important. "I gave the note to Miss Humphreys, and she said, of course. She said she hoped you'd be able to give the class a talk about South America, and I said, maybe." He looked up at his father rather uncertainly. Miss Schultz gave a little gasp, and Mr. Buckley brightened. "That would be a wonderful thing. Yes," he exclaimed, half turning to his secretary. Then turning back to his visitor, he said, "Perhaps at a special assembly? It would be wonderful for the children and—" He stopped. Major Thompson pursed his lips, first cocked his head dubiously, then shook it, remarking that he doubted there would be time. At a gesture from him, the boy began rapidly to button the coat. "What, you won't mind my asking, I'm sure, what," Mr. Buckley inquired, "is the educational system like down there?" The major said it left something to be desired. "That's one of the reasons I've never sent for Jimmy." "Aha! Ah!" The principal made quick noises of understanding. "Another was that I wanted him to grow up in his own country. He'd always be a foreigner down there. Why should he return and feel like one in the United States? Which is how it would be, you know. No, much as I have missed him, and will continue to, someday he'll understand." The corridors were crowded with children coming back from their recess, and Jimmy, holding his father's hand, walked with head up, proud, darting looks from side to side. Major Thompson subdued his own long strides. Whenever he passed a teacher, he made a very short bow. Even the big boys of the 6th grade were impressed and looked enviously at Jimmy. "That's his father. Big black car with a chauffeur and he's a major." Jimmy's head went higher. Automatically, he started to turn towards the small side door which the children generally used. But Barney, the short-tempered old janitor, saw them coming. Almost at a run, he reached the big front doors, gestured father and son onward, and swung the door open. "This is my father, Barney." It was not an introduction, but a declaration. Barney's head went back, his mouth opened, closed, opened. "Now I know where you get them high spirits from," he exclaimed. "Some of these people," he said to the major, "are always crabby and complaining, but I tell 'em, it's only high spirits. See, reason I understand. I used to be in the service myself. Oh yes, with General John Black Jack Pershing down in Mexico when we was chasing that guy Pancho Villa." "But he ran too fast for you," Major Thompson said. He and Jimmy went out the door. Barney's laughter cackled behind them. He trotted to the top of the steps and called after them. "You come down to my room there behind the furnace during lunchtime or after school someday, young fella, and I'll show you my pictures and souvenirs." Jimmy grinned with delight. "I will, Barney. I will," he called back. "Tomorrow, maybe." "Jarvis," the major said, "this is James, Jr. Good morning, Master James." "Gee." They found Mrs. Morley, assisted by a neighbor, struggling with her hair. "I was so excited," she said, "that I just had to ask Mrs. Marks here. She's lived next door to me for years. I had to ask her to come over and make me some coffee and help me get dressed. My Lord! After all these years, not so much as a letter, Mrs. Gibson—" Major Thompson cleared his throat. "I hope you appreciate my sister's situation, Mrs. Morley. Not that I excuse her. Do you know that she didn't even inform me of her marriage?" Both ladies exclaimed at this duplicity. "But she is, after all, my sister. It's her husband I must blame. That gentleman and I are going to have a little talk together, if I'm not much mistaken." Mrs. Marks nodded her head firmly. "Lining his own pockets, I suppose, keeping the money, not letting her visit the child." "It's not the food," Mrs. Morley explained. "It's not the room either, nor the time. As far as money goes, it's the clothes. That was my problem. I managed, but, what about the boy? What about Jimmy? How does it look? Everybody has a family, and he hasn't got a family. His father is in some far-off foreign country. His mother passed away. His aunt never shows her face. How does it look? How do you suppose he feels? No wonder—" "Now, Lindy, don't get so emotional," Mrs. Marks said. "I always said the father will turn up some day, didn't I? Blood is thicker than water. You do a good deed, you don't do it for nothing. Was I right?" and Mrs. Morley had to admit that her friend and neighbor was right. "Your check was very generous, Mr. Major Thompson," she said. "It more than took care of everything." But he denied this. Stroking his thin mustache with the tip of a finger, he said that the check could hardly make up for the care and affection which Mrs. Morley, bound by no legal or moral ties, had shown to his motherless little boy. "Well, I did my best. God knows I did my best." Her voice got all quavery, and she began to cry. The ice had begun to break up on the river when they crossed it. Jimmy pressed up close to the window of the car and murmured at the sight. Then he snuggled back in his corner of the seat and smiled shyly at his father. "Have you ever been to New York before?" asked the Major. "No. One time, my aunt said we were going to New York, but we went to Mrs. Morley's, and I thought that was New York, and she said she was coming back, but she never came back. I don't care," he added after a moment. "Listen, Jim, your aunt has her own troubles. Don't think hard of her. She left you in a good place, didn't she?" Their conversation touched on many subjects, and Mrs. Gibson, Jimmy's aunt, was soon forgotten. The boy wanted to know all about his father's faraway ranch, but interrupted almost immediately to tell how he had gotten into a fight with 3 bigger boys who didn't believe about the ranch, and he, Jimmy, had beaten them all up, all 3 of them, and they ran home crying and played hooky the next day because they were afraid to come to school and see him. "They thought I would make fun of them and beat them up again," he said. "And I would. I can beat up anybody." Major Thompson cleared his throat. "I'm sure you can," he said. "But don't bother. It's not necessary. If you know the truth, then it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. You don't even have to talk to them about it. Why bother?" Jimmy considered this, then renewed his questions about the ranch. He listened to the stories of the endlessly rolling South American prairies and the snow-capped Sierras, cattle and horses as far as the eye could see, the wide rivers filled with crocodiles, and the murderous piranha fish that would reduce a cow to its bones in 5 minutes, and a man in 2. The grass fires and campfires and bandit attacks. "Bandits? Were you ever shot?" No, his father had been often shot at, but never shot. "Were you ever captured by the bandits and tied up and put in a dungeon?" Major Thompson smiled, faintly amused. "Something like that," he said. Jimmy swallowed. "Were you all alone?" he asked. The car sped on through snowy fields and lonely farmhouses. The Major looked at the boy's concerned face and shook his head. "No, not alone. He had a friend with him who had been captured too." "What was his name?" "His name? His name was Captain Pasharooney." Jimmy's concern left him, and he laughed. "That's a funny name." Then, "No, it isn't. I was only joking." "Go on. Tell me." Early in the afternoon, they reached New York, where they had a huge lunch in a restaurant with wood-paneled walls and linen napkins and cut-glass pitchers of water. The Major had a cocktail, and his son had lemonade with grenadine in it. They both had grilled steak with French-fried potatoes and onion rings and lots of ketchup and a sauce with a funny name. Afterwards, Major Thompson smoked a thin cigar. He told Jimmy he could keep the big book of matches with the fancy picture on it, and, under the table, slipped him a crisp new bill and told him to tip the waiter. "Come and see us the next time you're in New York," the waiter said. "All right. This is for you." "Thank you very much, sir." They drove up and down the broad and busy avenues until the Major directed the car to stop. Then they went into a very big jewelry store where they picked up a tie pin and a pair of cufflinks for Jimmy, both with small sapphires set in them, and a brooch for Mrs. Morley. It was a crisp, golden afternoon with a hard blue sky overhead. While they waited on the curb for the car, Jimmy turned his head up and said, "You know what I would like?" No, Jim. What? A saddle. Jarvis opened the door and they got inside. Is there room at Mrs. Morley's to keep a horse? I doubt it. I don't care. I just want a saddle. Well, someday you'll have a horse. All right. The salesman in the store, which smelled richly of leather, had at first some idea of showing them children's saddles, but Major Thompson, without being told, knew that this wasn't what Jimmy had in mind at all. They bought a real saddle, full size, with stirrups, and a box of things to take care of keeping the leather in good condition. They went to the top of the Empire State Building. They went to the zoo in Central Park. They picked up some boxes of toy soldiers in old-fashioned uniforms, spent an hour in a theater showing newsreels and short films, and then it was supper time. And for supper, they had hot dogs, lots of them, with mustard, sauerkraut, and relish. Instead of going back the way we came, Major Thompson said, how would you like it if we took the ferry across? Jimmy licked tentatively at a small blotch of mustard. Do we have to go back? He asked. I'm afraid so, yes. But you'll come back with me? The Major nodded. But then, I've explained to you that I'll have to turn around and go away again. The boy considered, then said, Let's take the ferry boat then. The early night wind was cold, despite the crimson shadows still streaking the western horizon. The skyline vanished behind them. I'd like to look at the water some more, Jimmy said, but I'm cold. Let's go inside the cabin then. It was stuffy there, but it was warm. Jimmy pressed close to the window, shading with his hand against the obscuring reflection of the cabin lights, looking out onto the dark river intently. The Major lit another panatella. A man opened the cabin door. Their eyes met. The man vanished, reappeared a second later with another. Excuse me, son, there's someone I have to talk to. He flicked his cigar, got up, and walked forward. The boy barely turned away, then resumed his watch. Well, 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 said the bigger of the two men. Billy Rooney, of all people. The old Pasha himself, the other man said. He was thin. Gentlemen, surely you aren't going to Jersey for pleasure. Who's the kid? The big man said, ignoring the question. The thin man surveyed the astrakhan cap, the well-tailored overcoat, pursed his lips in a silent whistle. Who's the kid? Nice-looking boy, isn't he? You'll be surprised when I tell you. Remember Jimmy Thompson? He flicked his cigar again. This time the whistle was not silent. Sure I remember. That's the kid. I didn't know Jimmy had a kid. The Major's smile was brief. Jimmy doesn't know it most of the time himself, and when he does, he doesn't care. I thought I'd look him up, seeing that I was at liberty and his father wasn't. I suppose you have a lot of tiresome business you want to bother me about? The two men nodded. I thought so. Well, let me say goodbye. Taking out a cigar, which was not a panatella, the big man asked, How's the kid going to get home? It's a cold night, Rooney. I'm aware of that. He'll get home all right. There are some people here who have a car. They're driving him home. The two men watched as he walked back. Jim? He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm afraid that I won't be able to come back with you after all. Something has come up. But you can sit up front with Jarvis and the chauffeur, so you'll have plenty of company. The boy said, I have to go to the bathroom first. When he came out, the Major and the two men were standing together near the door. Jim, here are two old friends of mine who'd like to meet you, Captain Schmitz and Lieutenant Brady of the United States Foreign Service. James, Jr. Pleased to meet you, said Captain Schmitz of the United States Foreign Service. Likewise, said Lieutenant Brady of the same. They all walked to the big black limousine, where it was explained to Jarvis and the chauffeur that Jimmy would be the only passenger on the return trip. We'd better say goodbye now. There won't be time when the ferry stops. I don't know when I'll see you again, Jimmy. Stay out of fights and be good to Mrs. Morley. She's a good woman. He stopped as the boy reached up and clutched him around the neck. The embrace was brief. Jimmy started to get in the car, then turned around. I won't forget you any more, he said. I was just a little kid the other time. I was only 4 years old. Where's the saddle? Oh, there it is. He got in. climbing over Jarvis so that he was between him and the chauffeur. He bounced up and down, said, "Hey, we're coming into the dock." Then he leaned towards the window and called, "Thank you very much. I had a very nice time. I'll be real bigger when you see me again." Then he turned an eager face towards the quickly approaching ferry slip. Captain Schmitz said, What's with the car and the driver and the flunky, Rooney?" "Hired them from an agency. The receipts are in my pocket." "You sure do things in style, Pasha," Lieutenant Brady observed. The boat hit the slip, recoiled, bumped it again, slid along the greased pilings. A bell sounded. A chain rattled. "Well, after all, gentlemen, his father and I were old friends, not to mention our being roommates at a certain well-known establishment." His manner changed abruptly. "Can you imagine that SOB, though?" he demanded. "He's got a boy like that, and he doesn't even give a damn about it." The gangway fell into position. People streamed off the boat. Captain Schmitz said, "I suppose you wouldn't know anything about a certain Peter job down in the Loft District, Rooney?" "Never heard of it," he answered, once again serene. "It's got your name written all over it. First thing we said, oh, Pasharooney must be out again. Didn't we, Conrad?" asked Lieutenant Brady. But his partner had something else on his mind. "The kid looks like someone I know," he said, "and I don't mean that bum Jimmy Thompson either." Pasharooney was watching the cars as they drove off the ferry. "He looks like his mother," he said briefly. "Helen Farrell. She's dead." Schmitz snapped his fingers. "That's who. Yeah, sure. She was a real good looker." He turned to the man in the astrakhan cap. "If I'm not mistaken, you used to like her, didn't you, Rooney, before she took up with Jimmy Thompson?" The black car drove down onto the ferry dock. There was a movement at the window, which might have been that of a small boy waving goodbye. The man in the astrakhan cap waved back. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I used to like her a lot."
So what'd you think?
Okay, let's just deal with the simple base level stuff. When you read the investigations of Avram Davidson, which I think anyone who's interested in mystery needs to read that anthology. One, what you see is that most of the short stories that he writes in the mystery genre they are crime stories. They are not stories where there is a mystery. In other words, something needs to be solved. There are clues. The very last one, the historical that he writes, the
The
historical
importance of
fiction one.
trifles.
Say the name again.
The importance of trifles.
Yes, that one is set in like I think 1830s or 1840s New York City. One of the first legitimate police commissioners or police captains in New York City. That story is grounded in clues, and it is a mystery. There are suspects, and there is a verifiable solution that you can be like, oh, he followed all the clues, and this is the natural solution. Most of the stories are in that book. He's writing crime stories. There's suspense. There is a crime that is happening. They don't necessarily follow clues to find who was the murderer or whatever. And that speaks to my heart because that's the kind of crime fiction I write. I'm terrible with clues. I don't know how to do it. Ellery Queen wrote very plotted novels, and but Avram was able to do that because we saw that in other short stories of his and in the books that he wrote for Ellery Queen. He could follow a template and write those ghost-written novels pretty handily. This story, I fear, has gotten sort of short shrift because, like, if you go online, I read this short story and I just Googled the heck out of it and just like, what can I find out? What people say is like, oh, this has a predictable ending. Well, I don't think it's that predictable, and I actually think there's a lot of poignancy and depth to this story. I'm going to just say here are my notes. Here's what I mean. I will tell you what I did, but I also just tell you my gut feeling. The things that make this story special. Number one, the portrayal of the kid, Jimmy, just so on target and so sweet. And clearly he understands how kids talk. So you see Jimmy as he talks with his father, and we also see Jimmy as he talks with the headmaster, the secretary. We also see how he speaks with other kids his age, and that's so on target. But some of the most poignant stuff that Jimmy utters is stuff like Jimmy is blaming himself in the story for not remembering. I didn't remember. I was too young. I was only 4. I didn't know what pistachio was. It's like, and he just blames himself, which is so soul crushing as an adult to watch this. The major comes back into his life certain times in his life, and it's like, the major is dropping all this cash. And my thought was like, what he should really be doing is setting up a trust fund to pay for the kids' therapy sessions when he reaches like 23 or 24 years old, right?
Right.
So, okay, so that's number one. Number two, it's extremely sentimental. It's a very poignant story despite the plot. And that works on 2 levels. It's the major's feelings for the kid's reaction to the major's affections, and also at the very last page of the story, it's the major's feelings for Jimmy's mother. And we're gonna get into that. In the introduction to the story, Grania, who I believe is your mom, is that correct?
Yep.
Was your mom? Yep. She says there is 1 plot twist, but I feel like it's more like 3 plot twists, and that's what keeps it from being predictable. And other critics online will say like, oh, this is a predictable story. I don't think this is predictable at all. There's a high degree of mastery here, and it starts the first I would say the 3rd paragraph in this story. He describes the guy getting out of the car. Major Thompson is walking out of the car, and he describes him as he was tall and broad-shouldered, though rather pale. It's not till the end of the story that we understand why he's rather pale. Now, here's the thing. He's pale because he's been in prison. I'm guessing that he was in prison in Sing Sing because that was the famous institution that was north of New York in Westchester, and everyone at that time, if you did time, that's where you went. And it was a famous institution that he references. I like the way that Major Thompson shares that tidbit with Jimmy. Jimmy asks at one point, like, did they capture you and put you in a dungeon? It's like, yeah, they did. And I was in there with, a buddy of mine, Pasharooney, is like, oh, that's a funny name. Yeah. Did they, what did they do? Did they torture you or whatever? I remember the specifics, but we understand, I think, as a reader of mysteries, you understand that he's talking about Sing Sing or penitentiary. And this guy was his cellmate. Maybe they worked crimes on the outside. Maybe they didn't. I suspect that they did because they know each other and they have this history. There was something else that I want to bring up here. Kate Wilhelm was a writer who knew Avram, and I think she actually gave an introduction to one of the short stories in the Treasury. And she's known for something called Wilhelm's Law. And what she says is, if you're going to write a short story, or going to write a book, you have to push yourself as a writer to come up with not like the first twist that pops into your head is probably going to be the one that the reader will anticipate. So you need to push yourself to the second twist. And then that's not good enough either, because that's not going to be that surprising. You have to push yourself to the third twist. And that became known as Wilhelm's Law in the science fiction and fantasy world. And I feel like he does this here because if I can like flip ahead, what he does is the the big reveal is big shock. He is not a millionaire. He's not a millionaire whatsoever. In fact, he's a crook. And he just got out and he just pulled off a job, and I'll talk about that. And he's flush with a lot of cash and he's spending it. He's rented a limo, he's rented a driver, he's rented a butler. Well, I mean a valet, bodyguard, whatever. He's bought himself a whole new suit of clothes, but and he's using these things to snow his way into the kids' school. He's snowing the kid's current caretaker, Mrs. Morley. He's snowing the headmaster. He's snowing the secretary. He's snowing even the janitor, because he knows that in the United States, people are snowed easily by money. They don't know much about what's going on outside their borders, so they're fascinated with like, oh, this guy has like a ranch in South America, and he has horses and cattle, and he knows just what to say to continue that effect, that mystery about who he is. So he's a very practiced con man, but he's genteel. He has a style about him, right? What I felt like I had to do was like the two things that like I had to go Google and figure this out was like, what's a Peter job? The cops refer to a Peter job, right? Like they show up on the ferry. They're like, we thought you were the guy who pulled off the Peter job in the warehouse. Just like, what the heck is? And if you go online, I had to go Google this myself. And a Peter job he's a safe cracker.
Oh, a safe cracker?
A safe cracker.
Wow.
Yeah. So that means like he knew how to break into safes, and the lore in crime fiction about safe crackers they're very methodical. They don't take a lot of BS from, the guy who drives the car. They don't handle guns. They know how to, they listen and they know how to drill. They can get into a safe and they can do it. The faster you can do it, the faster you can get out. That's what he's good at. The other thing I had to look up is like the Astrakhan hat. The best example I could find of an Astrakhan cap is if you ever saw the Eddie Murphy movie, the first Coming to America movie. Eddie Murphy comes to America from this fictional country in Africa, and he's wearing an Astrakhan cap, which looks vaguely military, but it's made of black, the wool of black sheep. Now, I know Avram knew this in the 40s before the Google was invented. He could figure this out. He wrote the story in 1967. He knew all this stuff that now, like, we're all like catching up and trying to figure out, like, what the heck did he talk? What was he talking about? So the twists that I see in this is twist number one. Major Thompson is not a millionaire. Oh my God, I'm so shocked. If it just stopped there, the story would be like so level, and I think it would surprise a lot of people. But then it's like, he's not Major Thompson. He's not the guy that he's been portraying. He's not actually Jimmy's father. He's actually Rooney. What was the first name? Is it?
So there's
Billy Rooney.
What's that?
I think it's Billy. Is it Billy Rooney?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So the cops, when they confront them on the ferry, are like, okay, you're Rooney. And we find out it's like, he says, he's a nice looking boy, isn't he? You'll be surprised when I tell you. Remember Jimmy Thompson? And it's like, I thought I'd look him up, since seeing that I was at liberty and his father wasn't. I suppose you have a lot of tiresome business you want to bother me about. And he's like, let me say goodbye to the kid. And it's like, well, this is kind of amazing, because Thompson and Rooney obviously roomed together in prison. He gets out. He's going to look up the kid. But then in the last few paragraphs of the short story, they realize, hey, you know, before Thompson married his girlfriend, weren't you tight with her? And he's like, yeah, I was. I liked her quite a lot. Which, and then he ends the short story there, which, I mean, I think any reader reading this, if you're careful enough, you're thinking like, wait a second, is he or is he not Jimmy's father? Like maybe he was Jimmy's father. Maybe she had this kid out of wedlock, and that's why Thompson didn't care for the kid, and why he feels compelled to keep staying in the kid's life at the risk of his own imprisonment. You know?
I mean, so you brought up a lot of things that I did not capture.
No.
I'll give you kind of just a couple of things from my perspective. So the first thing, and I've talked about this before, a lot of my job in the estate is to really work through the stories, make sure there's nothing wrong with them.
Yeah.
And then if I get joy out of them, it's great. And it isn't until I do the podcast that I get a chance to really dig a little bit deeper into a story. And what caught me on this one, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but as I finished this story, to me in the end, it was a love story.
Yes. Yes.
More than anything. And
yes,
and
it is. It absolutely is.
And that didn't resonate with me the first time I read the story.
Right.
But I actually didn't think Jimmy was his son.
Yeah.
But I didn't think about what you just said. The way I viewed it is he loved Helen so much.
Yes.
It didn't even matter
whether
this was
exactly
or that he was going to take care of him. Because I mean, part of me thinks, wouldn't he have just said it's my kid? Like in some ways to the cops.
Right.
Instead, it's like, I liked her a lot, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to do nice things for this boy, even if he's not my son, because I loved Helen so much. That's the way I
listen. I completely can accept that reading, and it's really up to us. It had that kind of poignancy of like an O. Henry short story, because I think O. Henry was terribly romantic at heart. He just couldn't resist telling you at the end of the story what you were supposed to feel. Avram trusts that you're going to come to your own conclusion. And here's the thing about ambiguous endings for short stories. In general, with genre, you want unambiguous endings to short stories, because if you're writing mystery or science fiction or fantasy, you want the person to leave and say like, oh, I understand how this ends. He's basically saying like, it's ambiguous, but it doesn't really matter, because whatever you bring to it, I've controlled the two possibilities. Either he's the kid's father or he's not the kid's father. And if he's not the kid's father, that's an even sweeter story, because he's still in love with this woman long past her death. And he will always be there for this kid, even if every time he gets out of prison, he has to pull a heist and get some pocket money and get back into the game and like dress up. But the style is he was always going to wear that Astrakhan hat, because that is his thing. That is how he got that name. And that was another thing I had to Google. If you look up what a pasha is in
same here. I did the exact same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I had to go look for this, and it is in the Ottoman Empire in North Africa, Turkey. It is a man of high rank in the military, and they all wear a fez or one of these crazy ass hats. And that's his thing. Like he, you know, for a while when I was in New York, I live in North Carolina now. When I was still in New York City, everyone was wearing these Afghan hats. I even have one. It's in a box somewhere. I think I wore it for like a year until it was like, it's not covering my ears enough. So like, I feel like this is something, again, that speaks to Avram's erudition. Like he understood like, oh, this is a guy who's pretty classy. He has a methodical way of ripping off safes. And his style is he's always known for this crazy ass hat that he wears. and the cops know it. He's the guy in the Astrakhan hat. But I have to ask you, isn't it interesting that it's the wool of a black sheep? And he, with the name Rooney, you know, everybody talks about Irish families with always have a black sheep in the family. So this is kind of, I mean, that's kind of like suggestive. I just think I think it's a beautiful short story. It's far more romantic than than most people give it credit for. If I were gonna shoot this as a movie, frankly, I think this could be a movie,
Yep.
but it has to be, okay, here's how I would adapt this. I would choose to do it, set the whole thing at Christmas in New York City. So we have, like, you know, Rockefeller Center, the Christmas tree, they're going shopping, they're buying all this stuff. So there's a sense of romance. And I would also do flashbacks where we see him and this woman that he loves. So we can kind of get under an understanding of what that relationship was like. But you know, I think it's a very powerful story. It is not fantastic. It doesn't have a lot of level of deep scholarship that the other stories of his do. But as I just demonstrated, it's like it's just deep
but it
enough.
does.
Yeah, it's just deep enough that it forces you to, like a modern reader, to go to the internet to find out all these references that he knew and understood in 1967. Did I show you this? I went online
Yeah.
to find the
Yeah.
cover of the Saint magazine. This is 1967. 50 cents gets you the magazine with all these writers, and here he is, Avram Davidson. They didn't spend a lot of money on that cover, obviously, but I'm guessing that he was probably paid about 3, 4, 5 cents a word. I mean, today the going rate for the major magazines in this genre are 8 cents a word. So, and guys like me are lining up to write for those magazines because they're the best ones in the industry.
Yeah. Yeah. Question for you back on if we were to adapt it, and I have a couple of thoughts I'd want to run by as well.
Yeah.
Who would you have play Captain Pasharooney, Major Thompson?
I first wrote down Matthew McConaughey because he has that kind of charm. I feel like he could snow, especially he can snow New Jerseyans and New Yorkers pretty
Yep.
easy, but he's got a Texas kind of feel. But then as the week went on, I thought, like, what about John Hamm? He's dashing, he's debonair, he has this kind of style, but with his work in Mad Men, we're almost expecting him to be kind of a bad boy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I went with and he may be, dare I say it, maybe a little too old now, but George Clooney, I thought
Yeah.
could also have played that character pretty well.
Yeah, I thought about Clooney. I thought he was almost too charming. I wanted to go with guys that were like, just, you have to keep wondering, like, are they for real? And I could also see them like pulling out that chair for was it Mrs. Schwartz, the secretary at the school, and like snowing the janitor.
I like Matt Damon a lot, actually.
Oh yeah, Matt Damon would pull that off in no second, in no time. It would be fantastic.
And then two other things that I thought about for adapting it. You could actually do it as a modern. You could make a modern version, which a lot of people look for. I mean, personally, I love the fact of when it takes place and would prefer that.
Yeah.
But you could make a modern version if you were looking at costs. And then the second is, yeah, I almost feel like the first 10 minutes of the movie is this story, and then you flash back all the way to everything that happens.
Yeah, I did think that these actresses may not be contemporaneous with McConaughey or John Hamm. I thought somebody like Laura Dern. I thought somebody like Laura Linney for the mom.
Yep.
For Mrs. Morley, who's now the current caretaker, I thought of Catherine Hahn, who plays the Agatha role in WandaVision, if you've ever seen that
I
series
have.
on the Disney Channel. Yeah. I think she just has this kind of like, nervous energy that I think would be kind of cool for that. For the cops, okay, bear with me. I know that you're two longtime narrators for these short stories are Stefan Rudnicki and Mark Levasseur. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep.
I thought like
and
you should
David
cast
Pickard.
them as the cops. Okay. I mean, I don't care. I mean, I know one is big and one is not is slight. I looked them both up online. I feel like they could pull it off. If not, I was thinking like this guy's is no longer with us. The actor Ron McClarty, who was a voice narrator. He narrated a lot of Stephen King's books. He was an actor. He often played cops, kind of a barrel-chested dude. He was one of the cops in the old Spencer for Hires TV series back in the 80s or 90s. And he also wrote novels. He was a novelist. And Stephen King, late in life, in his career, in McLarty's career, said like, "Oh my God, people should read McLarty's work. He's great." And he actually had like a sort of a renaissance of his career because Stephen King. So he would be a great character. He's no longer with us. He can't play that. Rick Rossovich, who was in the old Roxanne movie with Steve Martin.
Yep.
Bradley Garrett, or who was in Everybody Loves Raymond, the big hulking guy.
Yeah.
Seems like he would be a great cop. There's an character actor named Ari Gross that I've liked over the years. I thought, but these are all white actors. I also like Regina King, who is a phenomenal actress and director now. And she was in she played a cop, and I believe the series was Southland. And I think she would be amazing in that role. But I feel like they have to do some kind of flashback because we need to feel the emotion that Rooney feels for this woman and understand why he would risk his neck for this kid.
Yeah. One thought going just back to the story itself, and I don't know if you caught this, and I wish I'd actually written down the section, and you may not have, but at one point there's a conversation where maybe it's the cops call him comrade.
I'm sorry, the what?
At some point there's a dialogue in the story where someone calls him comrade.
Yeah, I'm not sure where the heck is that.
And that's okay. We don't need to spend the time trying to find it, but there was I wish I'd written that down because it struck me as there was some clue there. There was something to that.
Yeah. Yeah, like maybe this was a pseudonym or an alias that he used in the past, or maybe that was his original name.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
Yeah. And then before we get going, I mean, first of all, I want to when I read this story previously, and even
what did you think about it when you first read it?
Yeah, so I was saying earlier when I first read it, this is kind of like you said, this is a good story. And then when I read it again, I thought, you know what? As I said, I thought this was a love story, and I was really impressed. But I still didn't see the depth of the story until this conversation. And to me, now as I go back and revisit, it's like, whoa. And I think you're right. It is missed about how sophisticated this story actually is.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that people should revisit it and take a closer look at it. and I'm just sort of blown away. And thank you for bringing that out, because I just didn't see the depth to the story initially that's there, and that's, I think, the power of when you dig into a story deeper that sometimes you find. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. It was interesting for me to have to go back and like actually go into, delve into the internet to find answers to uh, a story that came out. I was born in 1964. This came out about 3 or 4 years after I was born. I didn't know any of these references. This is not something like even the idea that a silver dollar was considered like a fancy thing, like that the internet had to explain that to me. Like, oh, okay, they weren't making silver dollars, I think, since the 1930s, but the 1960s you could still find coins that still had some silver content, but not the dollars. So that was kind of a big deal for the janitor when he got that. But yeah, I mean, there's
Go ahead.
deeply affecting. It's a deeply affecting story if you let it work its magic.
Yeah, and I'll put it to you another way. When I asked you what story you're interested in, and we kind of went back and forth until we found the right story, I originally thought, oh, all right, this will be, I'm really looking forward to talking to you. This will be an interesting conversation. But I didn't realize the depth and complexity of the story. And it's just, again, as Avram does to me every time I dig a little deeper, just the magic that he brought to his writing that is sometimes missed. It just continues to
Yeah,
blow me away. And I just can't believe, uh, I hope that people continue to discover him and understand how complex and going back to all the different genres that he did. And I mean, it's and here's a mystery story that, oh, it's just a mystery story, but no, there's a heck of a lot more going
yeah,
on
there's a
here.
lot more going on, and it's powerful.
Yeah,
Good for him. Good for him that he could do that. And I guarantee you this story probably took him 2 days to write. He probably did a one draft the first day and then rewrote it the second day because that's what they all did. The goal
yeah,
was to get it in the mail and get paid. Um, and I'm really interested in the idea of author estates and keeping alive the work of authors who are no longer with us. And what you're doing right now, just keeping those stories alive. I mean, the best thing I can say to anybody who inherits the estate of a writer is keep them in print, get
yeah,
them noticed as much as possible, because there are many situations where heirs get contacted by an editor who want to put out an anthology and they want to include the work, a short story by their um, ancestor. And it's like, okay, great, I'm going to make money. How much are you going to pay me? And it's like, well, I'm going to pay you $50. And most people will be like, screw that. I don't want to do that. That's nothing. That's not enough money. And the proper answer is yes, take the $50 and get it in print, because that's how people are going to discover it in the
yeah,
modern era. And maybe that'll lead to bigger and better things.
yeah. And from my perspective, again, as much as it's important for me to get his name out there, uh it's just a gift that I keep getting with conversations like this.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, this is probably the greatest gift I've ever been given.
Yeah. I can
um
believe that. I can believe that.
not I mean, monetary, there's not much going on monetarily, like, nothing significant, but from a pure just joy and love, and getting an opportunity to talk to people like you and digging deeper in these stories, it's the greatest gift I've, other than my wife and my children, probably the greatest gift I've been given, and I didn't even know about it for
Yeah.
for a long time.
Well,
So
that's what
thank
you
you.
need to do. And other people who have inherited estates like this need to do exactly the same thing, because it's the only way you keep these stories alive.
Well, before we sign off, any final thoughts that that you want to discuss or bring up? We didn't discuss you. What are you working on these days? And what should people, if you have one story you'd love people to find of yours, what would you recommend?
Oh, okay. You should, if you can go back in time and find the 2015 anthology Best American Mystery Stories, look for my story in that. It's called Harm and Hammer.
And where was it
it's-
originally published?
It was originally published in Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, and I forget what year, but that story has a lot of elements that I find appealing. Just obsession, how characters get obsessed with a particular topic. In this case, it's a young woman who's obsessed with the notion that she's going to learn to play the anvil like a musical instrument. And how many different ways can that go horribly, horribly wrong?
I can't wait to check it out. Say the name one more time.
Harm, Harm, and Hammer. Harm
Okay.
and Hammer.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else before we sign off?
Yeah, you can, if you're interested in any of my work, you can check out josephdegnice.com. No apostrophes, all one word. So that's it.
Great.
Thank you very much.
So
This is a
much.
great
It's been
time.
amazing.
I suppose
Thank you. Take care.
God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.